Hello and welcome back to another episode of Vikings Happy Hour, sponsored by Lake Monster Brewing, Eastside Jiu-Jitsu, and That's Badass Wood Art. Remember to like and subscribe to stay up to date with all the current Viking conversation, including today's, which is the 53-man official roster. And we have Eric
Don't
Eager.
say official.
Okay.
Unofficial roster.
Yeah.
Well,
there'll be changes.
The burning question I have just right off the jump here is for Eric. Do you think teams are really going to go into the season without punters?
It'd be so much fun if they did, but obviously I don't think that they will. It does bring you back to a time like I don't ask me why, but like for part of my job, I'm going through and looking at old transactions and like early salary cap days. So, right when this thing was being, free agency was starting, when they initially moved the active rosters from 47 players to 53 players, they used to make teams cut down to 47 this time. Mm-hmm. And then they used to bring players back. So like you would look back and be like, oh, the Vikings would cut Mike Tice and like bring him back. He'd start the first game and all this kind of stuff. That's kind of what it reminds me of, where it's like, how much do punters really matter? I know Ryan Wright's pretty good, but like all this stuff, how much do kickers matter? How much do backup quarterbacks matter? A lot less, apparently, in the eyes of these teams than we always thought, because they're willing to sort of expose these guys to other clubs, this time of year, which is always surprising given how much time they invest in these players.
Yeah. And by the way, I didn't give you a good introduction before Miles interrupted me. For those who don't know.
Then get it right. All right.
For those who don't know, Eric Eager of Sumer Sports. You can find the show page to his YouTube channel in the description below. 2,000 subscribers now, so bravo, sir. I know you guys are just churning out content on a daily basis. It's impressive.
Well, thank you. It's been a lot of fun. Thomas is a really good thinker, and it's always fun to interact with him. And I think we're doing some fun stuff, and I'm excited to watch another season.
So the non-official, according to Miles, 53-man roster came out today by the Vikings. Any surprises that kind of caught your eye, Eric?
Well, I'm surprised that Andre Carter and I'm not surprised. Like going back to the initial, like if we re-rack this late July, I'm surprised Dwayne McBride ended up not making it, but guys like Ivan Pace and Andre Carter made it. But, as the preseason evolved, like it was very clear that Ivan Carter was going to make the team, Ivan Pace. And then, and it wasn't clear to me that Andre Carter was going to make it, because I don't think he did much to warrant that. But they are looking obviously to depth at that position where they don't have very much. And, Dwayne McBride never really did anything, right? It never really was a thing where he looked like he figured it out, which, people like, basically every analytics nerd that I knew loved his profile coming out of UAB. So that was interesting. Hopefully he makes to the practice squad and they can develop him a little bit. A little surprised they kept Jaren Hall. But they have to develop a young quarterback somehow if they were to let Cousins go.
Can I ask you something about that, Eric?
Yeah.
So how would you have felt if the Vikings didn't pursue Trey Lance and then still were willing to get rid of Jaren Hall? Because I feel like there's some they're not similarities, but like a tie-in between the two, and the fact that it was obvious this offseason the Vikings wanted to add a young developmental quarterback.
Mm-hmm.
And so like obviously they had discussions with San Francisco in the spring about Trey Lance, couldn't come to a deal, and so they take Jaren Hall in the 5th. But so it kind of feels like to me like it was one of those two guys. And there's my kid being loud. So like just wanted to like get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think, the one thing that we know for sure about Kwesi Adofo-Mensah and his regime in Minnesota is they have conviction about quarterbacks. And I think that which is different than what I would have thought, right? I think, if Kwesi's come in, he hasn't really built the analytics staff that like we all expected him to. Mm-hmm. I think that he kind of, for lack of a better description, in year one, he kind of got Ryan Grigson in place. He did a lot of smart stuff in the draft as far as trading, but there was no there wasn't, it was a lot of like trying to be a normal GM, but very smartly, right? And so you could see that. And then a lot of what they're doing now is kind of analytics-y on the cap and contract side, but maybe not necessarily on the player eval side. And so you have the void years, and you have I think that the contracts that they've built out make a lot of sense. But the player selection thing, usually us analytics guys, especially now, it's like you look for value. You look at the consensus board. You look at a guy like, at 12, Pickett and Willis last year. He very clearly was convicted in not wanting either one of those players. Probably hits that out of the park for Willis. Who knows on Pickett, who looks quite good and was very efficient at the end of the season last year for Pittsburgh. And then last season last April, they're sitting at 23, and Will Levis has fallen into the lap. And again, if your big board is kind of like an aggregation of a bunch of big boards and some analytics, you're taking Levis there. If it's I have a grade on a quarterback that a scout has given me, and or a few scouts have given me, and Ryan Grigson has gone over, and that grade is a third-round grade, you're passing him up and you're taking Jordan Addison, which is what they did. I think similarly, with Trey Lance, I think that they have some conviction on Trey Lance. And so when those conversations happen with San Francisco, the price was probably too much. And now that he's played a little bit, I think that they remain convicted on him. An analytics person probably would have said, look, this is just a perfect buy low situation. Let's go fire on it. And they very, very much have conviction there. And there's a comment in there from Aaron's talking about Rager. Like, Rager is the perfect example. Rager, Blacklock, Hawkinson, all those guys, those are all buy low guys that Kwesi got, kind of independent probably of his own eval. And he just bought low on them. And with Hawkinson and to an extent Rager, it's kind of worked out. He does not have similar conviction about quarterback, which is interesting because now they're left with Jaren Hall, who I agree with you, Miles. Like if you were to like close your eyes to draft position, maybe there isn't much of a difference given that the fact that they're both kind of low sample guys with good athleticism and good physical tools that have yet to work out.
So Miles got to ask you a question. So I want to ask you one, and it revolves around the safety position and kind of the talk about Lewis Cine last week, but also the Vikings kept 6 safeties heading into this season. Now that can obviously change, but any thoughts on just keeping 6 safeties and even 4 tight ends for that matter heading into this year?
It's weird, man, because I think that the safeties thing could be because of how special teams are going to change. So I'm thinking about and tight ends as well, where you're sort of for one, Hawkinson's I don't know if Hawkinson's right. So keeping 4 tight ends to me is part of a hedge on Hawkinson's health.
That's a fair point.
Safeties versus linebackers. So you saw in that original one that they only kept 4 off-ball linebackers. Usually you keep more just because of special teams and stuff like that. But special teams are going to be different this year because I think the smart teams are just going to kick the ball out of the end zone, especially indoor teams, kick the ball out of the end zone and fair catch every kickoff, in which case you don't really need the bigger kind of special teamsy fullbacks, tight ends, linebackers to block. You need those guys for punt team and punt return. You don't need them for kickoff. So you can be a little lighter in your depth. And I think that that's part of it. I think the other part of it is, let's face facts, like Lewis Cine can't really play right now. And I mean that when he's healthy, he hasn't really demonstrated a penchant for this defense. And he gets hurt. Like he got hurt in practice the other day. Just by like walking around. So I think the spot, you're kind of keeping 5 safeties who can dress for you, and then one guy who's kind of, we're keeping around because it's a first round pick, and you can't really cut him.
Thank you, Too Evil to Hope, for that comment that made us all laugh. So Eric, my question for you, and I know that our guy Miles here was frustrated with this all day too. Can you talk a little bit about what they might be trying to do schematically on offense? In the last year, they had a heavy focus on 11 personnel, and it seems like they might be going back to the 12 personnel, 2 tight ends on the field. And of course, they have CJ Ham again, and they kept the 4 tight ends. So, what do you think that, Kevin O'Connell is seeing? I know he's also highlighted how he wants to find ways to get more open looks for Justin Jefferson. How he might be progressing with this kind of offensive lineup to make that happen.
Well, I think that they really want Hawkinson to be a wide receiver 3, essentially, right? And that's kind of how they played him, and that's really when he came over from Detroit. That was the value added, and it's funny because I think of, Hawkinson was tremendous for the Vikings last year, but you could still see that he struggles as a blocker. He struggles kind of in the complete game. You can't put his hand in the grass and play him at tight end like all the time. And so last year he was kind of like the grandparents, right? Where he comes in and he's just got to play with the kids, right? And to ask him to be a full-on parent where you got to pay the bills and clean the crap up and play with the kids, like that's kind of like what Josh Oliver's supposed to do, right? And I think that the sort of the delta between Hawkinson having that top end deal at tight end right now and where the Vikings are sitting with him is the fact that he isn't that complete player. And so I think what they really want to do is have Josh Oliver be a Y and play all the time. And, the last year with Johnny Munt and other guys, it was kind of just like, that's not tenable all the time. And they wanted to have Hawkinson play, especially because, Jordan Addison is smaller. He's got a lot of injury. I don't think it's going to be the traditional Hawkinson's the tight end, Addison, Jefferson, and Osborne are going to be the three wide receivers, and away we go. I think it's going to be more of early downs. You have Josh Oliver, Hawkinson. Hawkinson's playing off the line of scrimmage almost all the time and probably in the slot. And then you kind of rotate Osborne and Addison next to Jefferson. And that's kind of how you work with it. Additionally, because at running back, they're just not as talented as they used to be. I think it's still a solid move for them to move on, but they're going to need that extra kind of blocker at the line of scrimmage, I think, because you're just not going to, if you don't, you're not going to get as many yards before contact. And I think you're going to need some yards before contact with a guy like Addison, as much as I like him as a complementary type back. To me, it's just kind of, it's trying to complete the bad things about the offense last year, which was you didn't have an inline tight end that could really block. Your running back situation was better last year talent-wise. Now it's not quite as good. And I think it's kind of trying to patch all those things around and be a better offense as a result.
Has your expectation changed for the Vikings this season, like based on maybe who they kept or what you've seen through this preseason, or is it still kind of like that 8.5 win, season for the Vikings stuck in kind of mediocrity as we hopefully hit the reset in 24?
I agree with the 8.5 wins. In fact, I probably would put it more around 8. But I've argued with people on Twitter about this. Peter Bukowski of the
huge Vikings fan, Vikings fan.
And look, I've been the big. Somebody called me big Vikings opinion haver. I'll be honest, I've been a hater for a while. I think this team has a higher ceiling than I thought. You look at the offense. Let's spell out the Super Bowl case for the Vikings. It's Brian Flores finds a way to find 3 corners who can play. Okay,
they only have 4, Eric. So they got it the odds, right? The odds are there.
Yeah. Brian Flores somehow manages to find 3. And look, we saw it last year. The Kansas City Chiefs won a Super Bowl. In the second half of that game, it's 3 rookie corners in the AFC title game against Boyd, Chase, and Higgins. And they figured it out, right? So the most valuable player on a defense is the coordinator. And so they got Flores there, right? Danielle Hunter, 20 sacks, all that kind of stuff. Ivan Pace, a great linebacker. I personally like his story, but I think he's going to get run over if he ever plays. But that's the defensive case. Brian Flores finds a way to find corners, blitz, and Danielle Hunter looks like Chris Dolman for a year. And then on offense, I don't actually see that much distance between them and being a Super Bowl offense. The tackles are both all-pro type players. The guards, I think, can only get better, and the center got better last year. Tight end, I think they're solid, especially if Hawkinson can shake this. And the wide receiver group, if it's healthy, I mean, Jalen Naylor being the wide receiver 4 is a really good backup depth piece. Addison looks really good when healthy. That's going to be a big one. Can he stay healthy all year? Osborne's already good. Jefferson's the second best player in the whole league. And then I think at running back, people talk about Ty Chandler's age and everything. I think they have a good stable of running backs. I think if Nwangwu comes back and is actually healthy, and if Kirk, gets rid of age. But I got to say this, I think back, I watched the documentary, obviously. I think if Cousins had a better coach from the jump in Minnesota, and I mean better as in a guy that bought into him the way that O'Connell O'Connell clearly knows he's limited, but also clearly knows that a guy like Cousins needs a coach that's going to talk him up as opposed to the last guy who talked him down all the time. So going into the summer, I kind of thought they're kind of that same mediocre team, not a huge range of outcomes. I'm actually buying into now the fact that they have some probability of being really, really good. And that's something that I didn't open myself up to. I also think that they have kind of a, oh shit, this thing goes really bad really quickly type of, but I think that's always been there. I actually do though think in the NFC, they could have another really good season from a wins-losses perspective.
Go ahead, Matt.
Well, I was going to say, we talked about it at this show, but I think Kwesi has honestly set himself up for a perfect situation this year, because either they do hit that ceiling, like you mentioned, get a lot of wins in the NFC, maybe make some noise in the playoffs, and everyone's happy here in Minnesota, or the alternative is they fall below that 8-win threshold that you kind of mentioned. They're in a prime position to move on from Kirk and maybe take a shot at one of the rookie quarterbacks in the upcoming draft. So I'm kind of referring to Too Evil to Hope's question of like a letter grade for Kwesi up to this point, but like I'm hard pressed not to give him like a B or a B plus to this point, just how he set himself up for multiple different routes for the future.
Yeah, I think my biggest issue with giving him that high of a grade, and look, I'm rooting for him. I really do.
You're gonna say the 2022 draft class?
Yeah, I mean the point, and look, like you can say, and I think a lot of Vikings fans are hesitant to call the dogs off on Louis Seam because they think that means that Kwesi's already bust. And take it from me, like you can't evaluate a general manager on one pick or one trade. So like 2022 is one draft class. It looks snake eyes right now. And so that to me, I get a little worried there. I think that he's done a really good job as far as like the competitive rebuild with Byron Murphy, Marcus Davenport. He hasn't bellied up to the bar and make these huge commitments to players who I think are going to be helpful for the team this year. The Cousins thing's weird. I think, Kirk, like, I'll just put it this way. If they had contract structures the way that Kwesi does them now, when Kirk originally signed with the team in 2018, I think that they do a lot better. So I think Kwesi, with the void years and the kind of spreading it out over a few years and being able to manage it, I think he's done tremendous. So I think it's probably a C plus, B minus, because you can't ignore the draft classes, but you can also look at kind of how he's kind of taken this team that was in cap hell and no one wanted to talk about it and put it into a better place. So I think he's been above average, but closer to average than elite, I would say.
Yeah, I was gonna say I feel like the O'Connell and Kwesi regime has done a better job of filling in the peripherals and the outer layer areas of the team that I don't think Zim and co were able to do. Because I think Kwesi and them have done a good job of making sure that they have better depth. Now I think this roster, like top end wise, besides JJ, because we know he's the second best player in the league, but like I think they're like under Zim and Rick for the longest time, it was a top heavy roster with zero wiggle room. And I feel like this roster has a little bit more wiggle room because some of the depth is a little bit better, even if the ceiling of the best players across the board isn't as good. But I think they've done a good job coaching wise, and then just like around the edges of like a Brian Flores, keeping O'Connell, keeping Wes Phillips, and kind of keeping the system in place that benefits his quarterback and his offense. Like I think they've done those things better than the old regime to help things kind of. We talk floor and ceiling, but I think they've done a better job of like raising the floor slightly. But I don't know if it's really a ceiling raise, but I think it at least gives you a better stable baseline. And if they fall off a cliff, I think we'd all understand it's probably injury more than it would be like talent or like coaching, in my opinion. So that's yeah.
Yeah, it's strange because you had. I thought Spielman, and it's funny because like my boss, Thomas Dimitroff, who was the GM of the Falcons, he had a similar kind of at the end where he could nail a first round pick. And like when you look at Dimitroff from 2008 to 2020, no one generated more approximate value with the draft picks per pick. And a lot of that is just like nailing the Julio Jones and Matt Ryan and guys like that, Jake Matthews and stuff. And at the end there, though, it was tough because they in many ways kind of like the cap caught up to them. They were chasing after a Super Bowl loss, and it just kind of, to your point, the depth went away. Kwesi, so again, like this is like a very technical point, but it's important. You know, when Kirk signed that original deal, 3 years, $87 million, it was 3 years only, and the 87 was over all 3 years. And it was such that when you got up to a year, 2 years in, you had to extend them because it was never going, like you never got to smooth the contract out. And now they have these things called void years, where essentially you can tack on years and spread out the cap hits over years. Yes, when Kirk leaves, there's going to be a big bill to do. But when Kirk's here, you can use like Marcus Davenport, 1 year, $13 million. That sounds like a lot, but it's really 1 year and like 6, and then another 6 later when the cap is higher. And so, you know, if you were to go back to the well with Marcus Davenport, that's great. It just goes on to his new contract. If not, then you can, you just, you know, you're like, great. It was worth to have depth around Kirk Cousins because nothing really matters unless the quarterback is resolved. And so it was, he's using those instruments exactly how you're talking about, Miles, which is building depth and kind of fortifying the roster and saying, look, if we don't have a nickel corner or a left guard or something like that, and those are bad examples because that's kind of where they're weak. But if we don't have TJ Hawkinson here, this offense is going to fall apart. So I'm going to buy now, pay later. And when I pay later, it's going to be at a cheaper rate because these are interest-free loans on the cap. And I think that doing that instead of doing what Zimmer did, which is kind of trying to always prove his prediction about Cousins right, which is this guy's a bum, we can't win with him. These two guys are like, well, he is an imperfect quarterback, and this isn't the best situation, but let's make the best of it. And I find that very endearing about those two.
On top of using the void years on the contracts, do you take anything with Kwesi doing a lot of short-term deals or not committing, you know, long-term up until this point to any player with the opportunity to get out if it doesn't work as being an important part of the strategy?
Well, I think that's exactly using the void years allows you to do that, right? Because you can spread out. And again, the thing with the void years is that it all accelerates if you let them go. But if you keep them, those same hits get spread out. So I think that's part of the whole plan there, because you know the Vikings are a very top heavy team and this is because the guys that Spielman drafted. Darrishaw's an all-pro like a type player. Brian O'Neill is an all-pro type player. Jefferson's one of the, you know, and you want to save those big ass contracts for those guys. And so, you know, the weak link stuff. Now, this is again where I get a little bit sideways with Kwesi, which is you have to know which one of them are the premium positions and which aren't. And that's like what the Lewis Cine draft pick kind of, you know, wasn't great because, and that whole draft, frankly, guard second round, safety first round, and then linebacker third round. It's like what I'd rather him do is use the big contracts and the big draft capital on premium positions, and then to your point, use those 1 year deals with some voids on the guards that always, you know, made the Vikings offense worse than it could have been, or the nickel corners that always made the defense worse than it could have been, et cetera, et cetera. And back before you had the void years, Spielman would be like, well, we have a crappy cap, so I got to sign this guy for 3 years and spread it out over 3 years and worry about it later. And then if that guy, you know, failed, then you were stuck holding the bag on a player who stunk. Whereas now you're just like, no, we're not making any pretenses about this. It's a 1 year deal, but we're going to treat it like a 3 year deal on the cap. And so it's spread it out. And I think it's good. The only piece of feedback I have is do that at safety, not at positions that matter. Do that at linebacker. Do that so that it's just more economical for your team. Because
the Jordan Hicks signing is like an example of that he could have done for Lewis Cine instead of drafting Lewis Cine at 32, right?
Yeah, because running backs, linebackers, safeties, guards, and centers are always available in free agency. Always. Right. Starting caliber players are always available. And that was also the big, you know, when everybody gives me, you know, when I give, you know, the Kirk Cousins thing, like you shouldn't have had to draft Garrett Bradbury. You should have had enough cap space to go out and sign a veteran center, you know, and not have to use the draft capital because you were so up against it cap wise, right? You should, and think about like Cincinnati, for example. They go and they draft Miles Murphy this year, and they draft, they don't need Miles Murphy, right? They just know that over time they're going to need a ton of, blue chip ish type premium positions. They draft Dax Hill. Now, Dax Hill is a little bit of a tweener at safety and corner, but they knew that Jesse Bates was a year into the future. And so when you don't use the draft on needs at non-premium positions, you can build a roster where you wake up and you're like, how did 2 years from now, we're going to say, well, how did they let Trey Hendrickson go? It's like, well, they have Miles Murphy and Devin Osai and all these guys that they've invested in and were smart about. And then they went and patched up nickel corner in free agency because it's widely available. Guys like Desmond King are available all the freaking time, Steven Nelson, so forth. And again, like I think that's the part. And now he said it this draft when he took Addison and all those other, we got good players at premium positions. So maybe he turned his thinking around. But that first draft is going to hurt because they used premium capital on non-premium spots.
I do want to ask you one question because I know you have to leave in 4 minutes. I shot you a note a couple weeks back because I was listening to your podcast with Matt Collar, and I still don't quite understand it. So can you explain the potential Kirk Cousins extension for 2024 if he sticks around in what? Because it can't exceed a certain dollar amount, correct?
Yeah, yep. And this is another part where you get an idea that Kwesi kind of knows what he's doing, and maybe Rob Brzezinski, it's a little bit of a leg. But so what they were trying to do, and you can go back and look, it's these funny things where when they used to do trades back in the day, they were oftentimes because guys were holding out. And so usually what they would do if there was a cap issue, they would sign a guy to like a really crappy deal, and then they'd trade him so it would work for the cap. And then they'd re-sign him to a bigger deal. And obviously that's skirting the cap and all this kind of stuff. And so they made a rule essentially within 12 months, you can't sign 2 extensions, the second one being bigger APY than the first. And so ultimately what they did and again, I might be flubbing the exacts of the rule, but that's kind of the spirit of it. And so when they signed Kirk to he had to agree to the extension, not the restructure, because they added voids. And so he agreed to a deal that essentially, moves the Vikings' hand a little bit because they put void years on it, but they put paragraph 5 on those void years to the point where that deal was effectively now a 5-year, $200 million deal. Now, none of that money is going to see the light of day other than this year's because it's just going to void. But what it does is say, if they were to change their mind and extend Cousins over the next 12 months after the deal, it would have to come in at a lower APY than $40 million a year. And so essentially, and this is a very smart thing the Niners did last year too, where when they redid Garoppolo's deal, they made it so that they couldn't tag him. And I like these things where teams are kind of when things are kind of cooled down, they put in restrictions for themselves so they can't go crazy. Because like if Kirk has like an amazing playoff run and they lose in the conference title game, and it might still not be a great bet to buy into him because of age and all this kind of stuff. And you have that guardrail there, right? Where he's going to be like, well, actually, I'm worth $45 million. And it's like, well, they have to let him hit the open market then. And if he hits the open market, then anything can happen. Whereas, if he still wants to play in Minnesota because he's got the feels for this place, he knows that he cannot get a contract that's more than $40 million APY. And so it is a nice guardrail for Minnesota because I think that's right around the right number. If he comes in and plays next year at $35 million a year, I mean, I'm the biggest hater of that contract that's ever existed. I would be okay with it, I think, just because he would have earned it. But if he comes in at 45, we all know that it's not going to work. So I like that from Kwesi. It's a pretty sharp move from him.
Well, and can we talk about the dead cap? I know everybody loves to talk about the dead cap, but I think the one thing that like this dead cap doesn't do for Kwesi and the Vikings is it doesn't hamstring them in the way Rick had basically set up Kirk's contracts. Kirk had all the control, like all of it. Whereas I feel like, to your point, the guardrails and like what he can get long-term from the Vikings doesn't exceed. But that dead cap also it's already the effective cap space that the Vikings have in 2024 and beyond is already in place. So yes, that's a large dead cap hit, but like that's not holding them back from anything else because they've already like put that system in place to where they know what type of cap space, obviously before the Jefferson and Hawkinson deals, but like in general, they know what type of like dollars they're going to have to work with or without Kirk next year. And it's not going to like, they don't like have to re-sign Kirk because that dead cap is going to like kill them next year. Does that make sense?
Yeah, they're planning it out better. And you look at the teams that are actually doing this effectively, it's teams with really generous owners like Cleveland and Philly and Minnesota. So because the cash has to be a thing, right? You have to if you restructure a deal, the ownership's got to put that cash into escrow right away. So it's not it's cash and cap. So the fact that the Wilfs are willing to spend on the Vikings is a huge edge. The fact that Kwesi understands the assignment in that sense, and he's going to take the interest-free loans on these things, that's good. And to your point, there's some control over the situation. Additional to that is you know teams are becoming more liberal with how they roll over cap space, especially the spenders, the teams that will spend, because the some of these teams can't roll over cap space because they haven't spent enough money. The Vikings don't have that problem, so they can like sort of roll over what their cap space is now, like 10 to 12 million. They can roll that over, and so all of a sudden, some of that 28 million that Kirk is going to be owed against the cap next year is going to be offset by stuff like that. And in addition, when you do it that way and you're not up against it all the time, you have that money free in case you got. Like, let's say they start 6-1 again,
right?
And they make a trade. They have that money. They don't have to worry about it. If not, they roll the cap over to the future.
Yeah, I'm impressed with how they're kind of handling everything. So, Eric, I know you have to go. So, thank you for joining us, everyone. Go check out his stuff at Sumer Sports. Also, his book.
It,
I don't have the title of it offhand, but go order this book.
I got to get me a copy.
Football Analytics, Python, and R, Amazon. I think it comes out September 26th or something, but I got my copy here. Appreciate you guys, and this was a lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to watching the Vikings this year. So have a good one, guys. Skol.
See you later, Eric. Thanks you very
Eric.
much. Bye. Learn so much from him every time he's on the show. I know
let's talk 53. Should we talk 53 a little bit?
Yeah, I was gonna say I know you guys got to leave a little bit here too, but let's quick jump on the 53. And shout out to everybody in the comments. We appreciate it. Hit the like, hit the subscribe button. We're giving away this hat, not the one I'm wearing, but a similar one. Once we hit 3,100 subscribers, so go hit that like and subscribe button on our YouTube channel, and of course anywhere you find your podcast. So we touched on it briefly: the 6 safeties, the 4 tight ends. Nick, what was your biggest takeaway from the official, non-official 53-man roster released today?
I would say it's that we need another corner. That's the first thing that sticks out. I mean, the roster isn't done. I left with a series of questions from it. We need that, 5th cornerback because Najee Thompson's not it. We still don't know the health of Kenny Nwangu. I mean, if he's going to be put on IR tomorrow, we're going to sign another running back. And then, going back to what we talked about with Eric, are we really going to keep 6 wide receivers and 4 tight ends? We only have 8 offensive linemen. I think every year in the past few years, we've kept either 9 or 10. I know Chris Reed's supposed to come back, and we redid his contract in week 4, but that's still about a quarter of the season.
Yeah.
It's a quarter of a season. We won't have them. So I think that there's a lot of things that need to get done. So, who are those guys at the bottom of the roster that, would be that 4th tight end or Jalen Reagor if they can work on a trade or if it's, we have 6 safeties. I've been pushing for 6 safeties, but maybe we don't need Theo Jackson. So I just think that there's, a lot going on in the roster that's going to formulate over the next, 24 to 36 hours.
I did find it interesting, Eric's comment, because when we talked about keeping 6 safeties, he brought up special teams and the reason, like with kick returns and whatnot going on, that teams maybe don't feel like they need more linebackers and they can maybe invest more in just the secondary. I found that interesting as a take to keep 6 wide or safeties.
Yeah, but I feel like that kind of fits a little bit more at cornerback because safeties aren't out. Like the one issue, the Vikings have 4 cornerbacks essentially that can play outside cornerback. They don't have anybody else. And when you play three cornerbacks at a time in most base defenses, you only have one backup to play on the outside, and injuries happen. Like, that's just the NFL at a position like cornerback. It's not about like, it's a tough position to only roll with 4 effective cornerbacks in a defense that does use a lot of DBs, which I think that's why they're keeping some of the safeties as well, is because Metellus is in that like dime star role. And I think they're going to want other guys to get opportunities, or they might get opportunities because they have the bodies, but those bodies don't fit on the outside. They're not going to cover on the outside against they're not going to replace it in a Caleb Evans, or, Byron Murphy's playing that like hybrid nickel outside role. But like, they just don't have, like, that's why I was a little surprised Joanne Williams didn't make it, just because he's like a big, long press corner.
Well, that was the big thing you called out in our prediction, is like the size of Joanne Williams.
Yeah,
it wasn't even that around.
Right. It wasn't even about like me thinking he was really good, but he was like cheap, and he's a depth player. Right. But it doesn't mean they won't go out and get somebody. And I think, to like Nick's point, I think they're definitely going to do that. But to kind of answer some of the questions here, like, I've seen people asking about like Andre Carter. The Vikings gave, like, I think it was money. Like the most like guaranteed money. It was like the most guaranteed money to an undrafted free agent in like the history of the NFL, or like in the history of like this process. Right. And like that is enough.
300,000?
Yeah, I think it was like 300, 320 or something like that. Like, that's enough money to like you can get rid of a Luigi Villain and maybe even bring him back on the practice squad. Whereas an Andre Carter, you're like, you have an investment in him, and so you want to see that investment through. And he might have shown enough behind the scenes to like show some potential that's like more of a teachable thing and a developmental thing than it is like, because he's obviously got the like physical tools. He's big, he's lengthy, like he could probably put on some weight, but like big, lengthy, athletic. So I think it's more of like a teachable development thing. So like him being on the roster is not a problem. And no, they don't need to trade away Wanham. Like, Wanham is clearly their third best like pass rusher right now. I'm not the biggest DJ Wanham fan either, but they don't have the luxury to move those types of guys right now. Not this early in the process. Now, if they start 2-4, whatever 2-5, and they get to the deadline and they want to move guys like that because they're on expirings, like, I got zero issue with that, but that just doesn't work right now when a team that wants to be competitive. But then when we go to the tight end situation, I don't get it. I like Nick Muse, and I do think Eric brought up a great point that we don't know about TJ Hawkinson, and it might be hedging their bets on maybe he isn't 100% healthy, so they're making sure heading into week 1 that they have at least 3 tight ends that they can play if Hawkinson isn't ready by week 1. And they could also like wait. Sometimes teams will keep young guys on their roster and wait a little bit toward the season and then waive guys, because less teams are willing to like move their practice squad players. So it's not a lot. Like,
it's a strategy,
but there's small strategies that they could be doing with him, or he could just be on the team. And I'm overreacting, but it just feels like in an offense that has so many skill positions at tight end already and at receiver, to like keep 4 tight ends and a fullback, it just seems like a lot. But hey, is what it is.
One call out here. So first of all, this graphic is from Andrew Kramer of the Star Tribune, but just a call out on the defensive line. Jaquelin Roy is not on this list, and he is on the 53.
He is on the 53.
So just keep that in mind going through here. The other kind of
well, real quick, the high times KG, it's the 300K. It's not about it being a defining number. It's that his contract is essentially like a draft pick. So like they gave him enough money, and he has shown them enough that they put more investment into him than they would Luigi Villain, and they've seen Luigi Villain for over a year. So I just don't like using the like. I think Villain has been good in the preseason, so I'm not gonna like sit here and say that. But like, it's clear that they don't think he's been good enough that it's like worth risking him hitting waivers and keeping Andre Carter to develop. So I just don't think it's like that. Like, we get worked up over like the bottom of the roster guys a little bit more than I'd like to, and I do that at times as well. Like Nick Muse, I'm not mad that Nick Muse made the roster. It's more of like the scenario of the situation, but like, it just kind of is what it is. Like, teams have guys that they like, and they're going to keep them.
Yeah. The other kind of surprise for me, but not a surprise, is Jalen Reagor making the team. Now, I think in the next 24 hours, maybe even 48, we could see him get moved. We heard some trade buzz surrounding his name, but 6 receivers heading into this season as well, which is I don't have my graphic anymore, but I think that's the most since 2021, if I recall.
Definitely before the new regime came in. Yeah, that's interesting. And I think that we were seeing some stuff online that potentially he had some offset language in his contract, but that's, if he gets waived or is that wrong?
Yeah. No, that's what it is. That's what I wanted to confirm that too. It was like, obviously he's still, he's not a vested vet. So if he gets waived, he gets waived so teams can claim him. And that would be the only way a team would, the Vikings would like move his money is if another team claimed that contract. So they'd be claiming his contract. And so that money would go with him. But if he's waived and unclaimed, then the Vikings eat that $2.4 million dead cap essentially, because then his contract would then go void and then he could go sign a new one. But that money would then stay with the Vikings because it's guaranteed.
Mr. Kirk Cousins brings up an interesting point that I don't know if we've really entertained it quite yet, but just keeping 3 quarterbacks on the team seems like a luxury and not necessarily a necessity. Where are you guys at? I know we've talked about it at length, just given the new rule from this past year about being able to suit up a third quarterback on game day, in the instance that something happens. But what are your guys' thoughts on actually carrying 3 quarterbacks for the first time since, gosh, I can't even maybe Ponder, Bridgewater, and Castle were the last time we had like 3 active quarterbacks on the 53.
No, it was Keenum. It was Keenum.
Keenum, Bradford, and Bridgewater as well.
Yeah,
but what are your guys' thoughts there? Like, are you surprised? Or are you just you don't care? Miles doesn't care.
I would say that I thought it was important for them to draft a mid-round quarterback or so this year. I don't think that I think that everyone on the show is a fan of DTR over Jaron Hall, but that's water under the bridge at this point. But I think it gives a good test run for their administration, their coaching staff to go through like what a rookie quarterback looks like. How do we develop them? Get out the kinks, allow Kevin O'Connell to work with another guy, test some things behind the scenes. And then when it's time for, showtime, when it's a first round quarterback or something like that, maybe they won't repeat some of the same mistakes. But I think it's always nice to have a guy back there, that you're really working on. And it seems that Kellen Mond just wasn't it now that he's, gone from, another team. And so you always want to have someone, that you're working on behind the scenes just in case, and you never know what's going on with, different contract demands of Kirk. And so I think when you vested a 5th round on him, I don't mind them keeping a roster spot to, continue working on that and see how it goes. So I'm really kind of indifferent to it. I can understand now if this team was, I think if it was like a championship roster or something like that, and, we really needed that other spot to keep a guy that, was going to really contribute this year, then maybe it's a conversation, but I don't think we're there. And we also have another, redshirt guy and like Andre Carter, on a roster. And, from that standpoint, so I don't think it's really any different than that. So it doesn't really bother me at all. I like, KOC, investing in quarterbacks and seeing how it can develop them. But I'm also not fooling myself to think that, Jaron Hall could be, a long-term franchise quarterback either.
But
I'm still waiting to go watch the JT O'Sullivan QB school.
Oh yeah,
I know.
That he just released this afternoon.
But like I think Digits brings up a great point. Is like that new rule does afford more development in QBs.
Sure.
And teams wanting to invest in that third quarterback because of the injuries too. But it also like the special team scenario as well, where teams or the NFL is kind of doing away with like some of the high impact special teams. So like it's becoming less and less important, is allowing teams to like, it's unfortunate for players that are like special teams, like players like a Najee Thompson, for example. I know he made it and I'm happy he did, but like teams are less likely to keep guys like him at time, not just like him as an example, but like special teams only players, because now they can have a third quarterback instead. And like that value is more important than like a special teams player, because that guy you might need to play at some point because quarterback is just that important. So I like that rule from like a development standpoint. And I think it allows guys that a team does draft in the middle rounds as like a less pressure to like be the backup, because, you know, we have seen a lot of the rookies this year, like win either backup jobs or like these like third string roles like Jaren Hall, where, you know, they're playing better and kind of getting that like development without the pressure of having to do it. So it's kind of a cool thing to see.
Biggest surprise for me was 3 undrafted free agents making the team. I think that's impressive in and of itself.
How many did they have last year? They had Villain, I guess Ryan Wright technically is considered that.
Yeah.
They had one.
So maybe they did have that many last year.
Well, so they ended up signing. Wasn't Benton Whitley an undrafted free agent that they ended up bringing on?
Yes, Whitley, and then oh my God, Kwenkwu. They signed him to.
Oh yeah.
So I guess there were a handful last
year. Tonga, but like those guys aren't like he wasn't a free agent like he was a like street free agent last year or whatever. But
any final, because I don't want to prolong this much more. I mean, it's a 53-man roster that's going to change again in the next 24 to 48 hours, and especially by, you know, the time we take on the Bucks at US Bank Stadium. But any final thoughts or call outs that you guys want to talk about for the 53 that was released this evening? Otherwise, we can wrap this thing.
Well, what positions do we think that they should? I think we've touched on a little bit, but like, there's obviously corner. There's, I think, interior line. And I would say probably maybe running back.
I think those running back if Kenny can't go.
The 3, right? So like if they put Kenny on IR tomorrow, so that's one open spot. You maybe trade Jalen Reagor, that's 2, and then you fill those spots. You fill a running back spot, that's 1. And then you fill a cornerback, which I think they have to do. Like I think an Amani Oruwariye, he played for the Lions, was drafted by Lions. Like he's a long outside press corner. I think would be like he's fallen off the last couple of years, but he's just the type of guy that I think they could use that can play man coverage, and kind of just be a big outside physical corner. And maybe they get Joejuan Williams on the practice squad. You know, you never know, and like that'll help. But you still need a 53-man roster guy that I think they need to add to that depth.
I want to share one thing before we go.
Ike Bedker too at interior line, I think would be a good like signing over. I like Blake Brandel, but like I don't know.
Can we see it?
Oh yeah.
All right.
Yeah, it's a little difficult to see. I don't know if you can zoom in at all.
I can try. Give me a second.
Matt's not really that savvy with this stuff, Nick. So.
Hey, he did it. So
I agree, Matt. We do.
I was about to give a shout out to that tweet too. I know that you and Daniel House too are going back and forth, but that seems like a really good list.
Yeah, I just kind of went through and just saw some guys that like made sense, and obviously, I mean, they might not have any interest in any of these guys for all I know, but like these are just names that stood out.
Yeah, the one name that we've heard consistently from you, at least, it's maybe your name bias, but Myles Gaskin. Do you just want to cheer on another Myles this year?
Well, yeah, of course. Like, and he spells it. Well, it's because he spells it right too. It's not just the name, but it's like the spelling. My mom would be proud.
I think this is also a pretty important call out. You have him in here, but Eric Rowe is someone that, at least dating back to when we heard about Brian Flores becoming our defensive coordinator, I thought made perfect sense. He does technically, I think, identify as a safety, but he can play as that nickel cornerback.
They just have so many. It's hard. Like I'm hesitant with him. I just don't see it unless Lewis Cine actually is maybe a little bit more hurt too. We don't know that.
Sure.
But even then, that's why they have Theo Jackson too, and some of those things. But
absolutely. Well, I think that's it then. I think we'll kind of watch this roster over the next week or so and see what happens. Trades could happen. Obviously, the practice squad will fill itself out a little bit more. There were some other surprises around the league. Actually, one guy at Miles that I thought you would be interested in is Darius Rush, who we saw at the Senior Bowl, who was cut by the Colts.
I just don't know how his preseason went. Do we know? I
heard it went really well, so I want to go check it out.
He seems like a guy that will be long gone
Claimed.
before our waiver time anyway.
Yeah,
but,
what are we like 25, 26?
24.
Yeah, it's
You
mid 20s. So
just go to like, so whatever your draft pick like slot was, is
Oh,
where
yeah.
your is where it starts the first 6 games of the season, something like that. And then the
I
waiver
think
wire,
that's right.
then it'll go
Resets.
to whatever, resets to the current standings.
Sweet. Well, everybody in the chat, thank you again for joining us on this live show. Do not forget to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel, to wherever you get your podcasts. We really would appreciate it to help grow our channel a little bit more. And remember, if you're subscribed, you can get this hat, Lake Monster. We'll ship it directly to you. And speaking of Lake Monster, next Wednesday night is it 7 miles?
7 or 7:30? Yeah.
We'll say 7.
No, we'll say 7.
Next Wednesday night, September 6th at 7 o'clock, we will be live from Lake Monster Brewing in St. Paul, Minnesota, doing a live show. So come on out if you're in
Looking
the
to have a
city.
guest too. Looking to have a guest.
TBD who the guest is, but we'll be doing some fun giveaways there. There's great beer to be had, and that will also start the new live shows to be on Wednesday for the remainder of the season. It just works
If you
better.
slide through, Matt will get you a beer too. That's just like the kind of guy he is. He'll run a tab for you.
Yeah, if I'm thinking of doing some like trivia questions potentially, and then I would buy people beer.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, we'll get people beer if they want to come through.
Or they have other things if you don't like beer. I don't know I think they have some like sodas and whatnot. But come check us out next Wednesday night at Lake Monster, and then tune in every Wednesday night for our Vikings Happy Hour live show as the Vikings regular season kicks off just a couple weeks from this weekend. Until next time, everybody, Skol Vikings.